Colonies had supplied France with raw materials, food, and most importantly, men. And no one did this more than Algeria. France had seized Algiers in 1813 using the justification of an alleged insult of the French consul by the reigning Dia of Algiers. The conquest of Algeria by the French faced long and bitter oppression and opposition, led from 1832 to 1847 by the Algerian resistance led by Ak el Khedar. The French army used scorched earth tactics, and there were heavy losses on the indigenous Kabi and the Arab peoples, estimated to have been around 2 million people. It was not until 1857 that the physical occupation and complete pacification was achieved, only as late as 1881, and the conquest was not technically complete until the early 19th century. So at the turn of the century, the last stronghold was Tiague, which was conquered by the Saharan, came under full French control. So, judging by the date, Algeria was one of the first colonies the French had, and it was the last colony the French had. It was so important to the French because it was the birthplace of the French Foreign Legion and the Zouvan regiments that only served in colonial armies until World War One, so they didn't have so much action. Because remember, that whole era, especially the Franco-Prussian War, it was now being pacified, so you can't really have these on this. They may rebel against the army, so in that time they didn't really see skirmishes until World War One, World War Two. So in early 1914, when the war broke out, mandatory conscription, of course, forced labor, and guarding the border against Togoland, and the infamous one letter Vorbeck, but he didn't get as far as Algeria. The French had a monopoly on wine, sheep, for meat and fur, and grain and tobacco in Algeria, but they couldn't have the supply or the quotas they demanded because of the shortage of the general, young men, and skilled farmers. So now in North Africa, they had Tanzania and Morocco, but they didn't need to use conscription in those places. Only Algeria and Senegal mostly. And while there were a few young Algerians who wanted to serve for the motherland of France, it kind of brought hostility to the locals, especially Tanzania and Morocco right next to them. So why should it be Algeria and not Morocco and Tunisia? So that kind of created hostilities as well. There were no general hostilities, no reaction visible at the mobilization or recruitment and deployment of the Algerian troops for France on the French front. We can perhaps explain this by the existence of a kind of scared union, a Algeriani, which was exalted by the colonial masters and repeated by the envoys, understandably, due to as a glimmer of hope for these individuals and a help for liberation from oppression and discrimination, leading to the Algerian War of Independence. But this is World War One. They were mostly the first to die in assaults and fought in various fierce battles, of course, like Verdun, Chemin de Dan, Champagne, even on African fronts in German Togoland, Southwest Africa, to help the Allies with that conquest of Southeast and Central Africa. Also, they found themselves in the Middle Eastern campaigns with the Ottomans, of course, which they were most comfortable with, because the Algiers is close to the Sahara, so they're very comfortable in that desert environment. Found themselves the most comfortable. Also, they were pressured by the Ottomans and the Germans, because the Kaiser was honorably called Haji Wilhelm. Fun fact, in the Middle East they were pressured by the Ottomans and by some of the Germans in the Middle East and on the Western Front to join on their side for jihad against the colonial masters of France and Britain. The Germans going as far as making a POW camp called Half Moon for Muslims. Not all in Sato. The camp is actually called Half Moon, but it was for Muslims. They had music. They had basically the freedom to move around, to pray, and do other Islamic activities. It was called Hamle Gul Lager, part of the jihad experiment that the Ottomans and Germans were doing at that time. So in all, Algeria had the most to give and nothing to gain, like all colonies did. They came back to serve for the Vichy French and the Free French in World War II, and even went to the first Indochina Wars, but the Algiers had had enough, and by 1962, that is another war for another day.